tonight, we're going to travel further than most stories ever do. Not just across countries or centuries, but across millions of years, back through time, to the very beginning of what it means to be human. There's no rush, no need to focus too hard. Just let the story carry you, slowly and softly, as your mind begins to relax. But before we drift too far, I'd love to know something simple, something human. Where are you listening from right now? Somewhere in a quiet city, a small town, a room with the lights dimmed low, or maybe under a blanket with only the soft glow of your screen. And what time is it for you? Is it late at night, when the world is finally quiet, or early morning, just before the day begins? Or maybe somewhere in between, where time feels slow and still, and one more gentle thought to carry with you as you listen. As this story unfolds, as your mind drifts further and further into rest, what kind of dream do you think you'll fall into tonight? Something peaceful, something distant and ancient, or perhaps something you won't remember at all. You can let that thought fade now. There's nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to go. Just listen, breathe, and slowly drift as we begin our journey back through the quiet, endless story of human evolution. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the scale of what we are about to do together. Right now, at this exact moment, billions of people are awake across the planet, moving through cities, villages, coastlines, deserts, mountain towns, and glowing urban streets. We live in towers of steel and glass, fly through the air in machines heavier than birds, send our voices across oceans in less than a second, and store entire libraries in objects small enough to fit in a pocket. We are, without question, the most influential species this planet has ever produced. We alter landscapes, redirect rivers, build night into places where there was once only darkness, and send our tools far beyond Earth itself. But the strange and soothing thing to remember, especially tonight, is that none of this was guaranteed. It almost never happened. The path that led from tiny early mammals to you, here now, listening and drifting into sleep, was so fragile, so unlikely, and so full of accidents that it can feel almost dreamlike. And that is where this story begins, not with kings or battles or monuments, but with an unimaginably long chain of survival, stretching backward through forests, grasslands, volcanic winters, ice ages, and oceans of time. If we go back far enough, far beyond cities and farming, and even beyond the first humans, the world becomes almost unrecognizable. Long before our ancestors ever stood upright, long before stone tools or campfires or language, Earth belonged to creatures that would have seemed eternal if you were living among them. Vast reptiles moved through ancient ecosystems for millions upon millions of years. Forests spread across warm landscapes, and enormous bodies shook the ground. But even such dominance was temporary. Around 66 million years ago, a catastrophe from space changed the course of life forever. An asteroid struck the Earth with such force that darkness spread across the sky. Temperatures dropped, food webs collapsed, and the old rulers of the land were broken by a world they could no longer survive in. In the quiet aftermath of that destruction, While the age of giant reptiles faded, a different kind of creature endured. Small mammals, insignificant in appearance, hiding in burrows and shadows, survived because they were adaptable, because they were overlooked, because they needed little and could persist in a ruined world. This is one of the first great themes of our story. Survival does not always belong to the largest or strongest. Sometimes it belongs to the small, the flexible, the patient, and the unnoticed. From those early mammals came a wide-branching tree of descendants, and somewhere among them emerged the first primates. They were not human in any familiar sense. They were small, tree-living creatures, moving through branches in warm, ancient forests. But already, the foundations of our future were beginning to form. Their eyes faced forward, allowing depth perception in a three-dimensional world of trunks, vines, and dangerous leaps. Their hands became more capable of gripping, feeling, and manipulating. Their bodies learned the delicate balance of life above the ground, where one mistake could mean death. It is a beautiful thing to consider that so much of what we still are began there. The way your eyes judge distance, the way your fingers curl around an object, the way your brain effortlessly maps space around you. All of it reaches back into those quiet forests. Evolution rarely moves with dramatic intention. It works slowly, accumulating small advantages, shaping bodies not for glory, but for immediate survival. Yet those small advantages, carried forward through millions of years, would one day allow creatures like us to draw maps, write books, build telescopes, and wonder where we came from in the first place. As climates shifted and forests changed, the primate world changed with them. Some lineages remained small and specialized, while others grew larger, more social, and more cognitively flexible. Over long spans of time, apes emerged, distinguished by larger brains, more mobile shoulders, and a different style of life. They were no longer simply small branch runners in the canopy. They were stronger, more aware, and increasingly dependent on memory, social relationships, and adaptation. In them, intelligence began to matter more and more. Remembering where fruit would ripen, who in the group was dominant, who could be trusted, where water could be found during difficult seasons. All of this became part of survival, and once intelligence begins to offer strong advantages, evolution tends to keep investing in it. Not suddenly, not neatly, but gradually, generation after generation, as environments reward those who can solve problems instead of merely reacting to them. Then Africa began to change in ways that would shape the entire future of our lineage. Forests that had once stretched in broad continuity began to fragment as conditions became drier in some regions. Open woodland and early grassland spread between patches of trees. For ape-like creatures adapted mostly to life in forests, this created a problem. Food was no longer always close at hand. Shelter was less continuous. Distances between useful places grew longer. In that changing mosaic landscape, some populations retreated deeper into the forests, following the old way of life. Their descendants would eventually become the other great apes we know today. But some remained in these transitional zones, and by remaining there, they entered a new evolutionary experiment. They had to move across open ground more often. They had to scan farther, carry more, adapt more quickly, and conserve energy in new ways. This is where one of the strangest and most important developments in the entire history of life began to take hold. Upright walking. Bipedalism, standing and walking on two legs, seems obvious to us because it is what we know. But in evolutionary terms, it was bizarre, difficult, and costly. It altered the spine, the pelvis, the knees, the feet, and eventually even childbirth itself. It did not make our ancestors faster in a sprint than many other animals. It did not give them claws or fangs or armor. In its earliest form, it probably made them awkward, and yet it opened possibilities. It allowed them to carry food and infants. It lifted the head for a broader view across patchy terrain. It changed how the body dealt with heat under the African sun. It freed the hands from locomotion. And once the hands are freed, everything begins to change. This did not happen all at once. The earliest hominins were still creatures between worlds, partly adapted to walking upright and still partly at home in trees. They were experiments in progress, bodies caught between old solutions and new pressures. But the path had been chosen, even if no one walking it could possibly understand what it would one day mean. By the time of creatures like Ardipithecus and then the Australopithecines, we can begin to see this transformation more clearly. They were not modern humans. Their brains were still small, closer in size to those of chimpanzees than to ours. Their faces retained many ancient features, and some of them likely still climbed regularly. But they were committed walkers. Their pelvis and legs tell us this. Their feet tell us this. And perhaps most moving of all, fossil footprints pressed into ancient volcanic ash tell us this directly. Somewhere, millions of years ago, individuals walked together across soft ground, leaving behind impressions that survived beyond all memory. A heel strikes, a foot rolls forward, toes push off. It is one of the most intimate kinds of evidence we have from deep time, because it is not merely a bone or a tooth, but a moment. Someone passed by, someone went somewhere, someone lived an ordinary day in a world we can no longer see. And in those footprints, there is already something hauntingly familiar. The Australopithecines, including the famous Lucy and her relatives, lived for a very long time, far longer than our own species has existed so far. That alone is worth pausing over. We often imagine evolution as a ladder climbing toward us, but it was never like that. Lucy was not waiting to become human. Her kind was already successful in its own right, surviving for immense spans of time in changing African landscapes. They walked upright, they adapted to different habitats, and they diversified into multiple species. Some became more generalized in diet and body form. Others became highly specialized, with massive jaws and teeth suited for grinding tough plant foods. These were not failures in the simple sense. They were branches, experiments, different ways of being a hominin. For a long while, several of these ways coexisted. The human family tree was not a single line, but a dense and living thicket. At some point, however, one set of populations began moving in a new direction. Their brains grew somewhat larger. Their faces and teeth began to change. Their hands became increasingly capable of precision work. And then, somewhere in Africa, one of our ancestors did something that may appear modest from a distance, but was in fact revolutionary. They deliberately shaped stone, not merely picking up a rock and using it, which other animals can also do, but striking stone against stone to create a cutting edge for future use. With that act, intentional technology entered the story in a clearer and more durable way. A shaped stone tool is more than an object. It is a thought made visible. It means someone could imagine a form before it existed, understand how a material would behave, and act with purpose toward a result not yet present. That is a profound threshold. It is the beginning of externalized intelligence, of using the world itself as an extension of the body and mind. Early members of the genus Homo, such as Homo habilis and related forms, still looked primitive by modern standards. They were small-bodied and not yet fully transformed into the long-legged travelers who would later stride across continents. But their brains were larger than those of the Australopithecines, and their relationship to tools, meat, and learning was changing everything. Stone flakes could cut flesh from bone. Bones could be broken from marrow. Tough foods could be processed more efficiently. New calories became available, especially nutrient-dense ones that may have helped support further brain growth. A feedback loop began to emerge. Better tools could open richer food sources. Richer food sources could support bigger brains. Bigger brains could produce better planning, teaching, memory, and cooperation. None of this was neat or inevitable, but over hundreds of thousands of years, the pattern deepened. Childhood lengthened because there was more to learn. Skills had to be taught, practiced, remembered, refined. Culture, in its earliest human form, was beginning to matter almost as much as biology. Then came one of the most successful and consequential species in all of human evolution, Homo erectus. With them, the story opens out across the world. Their bodies were transformed in a way that at last begins to look strikingly human from the neck down. Long legs, efficient stride, endurance over distance. A body built not for climbing, but for walking and ranging through open environments. Their brains were larger again, their tools more consistent, their behavior more expansive, and most importantly, they left Africa. This is a turning point that is easy to say quickly and impossible to fully absorb. For millions of years, the story of our ancestors had been African, and in the deepest sense, it always remains African. But Homo erectus became the first human species to spread far beyond that origin, moving into Asia and across huge environmental ranges. They did not do this through a single heroic migration. Rather, generation by generation, following food, adjusting to local conditions, passing on skills, they expanded. Their success lasted for an astonishing span of time, far longer than our own species has yet endured. With Homo erectus, the control of fire also enters the story in a more powerful way. Fire meant warmth in cold nights, protection from predators, access to new places, and food transformed by cooking. Cooking changes chemistry before food enters the body. It softens, breaks down, unlocks, and makes energy easier to obtain. Some scholars think this was one of the key foundations for further brain expansion. But fire also did something subtler, and perhaps equally important. It created social time. Around a fire, the day does not end at sunset. There's light, warmth, attention, and the possibility of shared focus. Here, one can imagine teaching becoming deeper, social bonds becoming stronger, memory becoming collective. Around ancient fires, perhaps, the earliest roots of storytelling and more elaborate language found a place to grow. We cannot hear those voices, but we live in the echo of whatever they began. By the middle chapters of human evolution, the world was no longer inhabited by one humankind alone. Different branches of the human family spread, diverged, and adapted to different environments. In Europe and Western Asia, populations eventually gave rise to Neanderthals, powerfully built humans adapted to cold, seasonal, ice age worlds. They were not dim-witted brutes. That old idea has collapsed under the weight of evidence. They made sophisticated tools, hunted dangerous game, cared for the injured, and likely buried their dead with intention. In Asia, another mysterious branch, the Denisovans, evolved, leaving behind only fragments of bone and a powerful genetic legacy in living humans today. On isolated islands, other surprising forms emerged, including small-bodied human species, whose existence reminds us that evolution is never obliged to follow our expectations. For a long period then, Earth was not inhabited by humanity in the singular, but by humanities in the plural, several kinds of human beings sharing the world in different ways. And then, in Africa, our own species began to emerge. Anatomically modern Homo sapiens appeared gradually, their skeleton showing the rounded skull, reduced face, and more delicate build that we would recognize as familiar. Yet even here, there was no sudden transformation into modernity. Early Homo sapiens were biologically close to us, but culture and cognition still had more distance to travel. For tens of thousands of years, they remained one human lineage among others. What made the final difference was not merely larger brains, because Neanderthals had large brains too. It was not tools alone, because other humans also used them. The real difference seems to have been the combination of language, symbolic thought, social flexibility, and cumulative culture, reaching a critical intensity. Once humans could exchange increasingly complex information, represent ideas through symbols, preserve knowledge across generations, and adapt behavior faster than bodies could evolve, the pace of change accelerated. Our species also endured hardships so severe that extinction came terrifyingly close. Population bottlenecks reduced humanity to very small numbers at some points in prehistory. Climatic instability, volcanic disasters, drought, scarcity, and competition all pressed hard against survival. Yet the survivors endured, not because they were invincible, but because they were cooperative, inventive, and spread across connected but semi-independent groups. This pattern matters. We survived not as isolated heroes, but as networks. Knowledge shared, help exchanged, alliances remembered, resources located through collective memory. In many ways, the human story is a story about the survival value of social connection. A lone human is physically unimpressive compared to many animals. A connected human group, sharing skills and memory, becomes something entirely different. Eventually, Homo sapiens expanded out of Africa and across the rest of the world. Unlike earlier human species that had also left Africa, these populations carried with them a more developed package of symbolic culture, language, flexible technologies, and social coordination. They moved along coastlines, into forests, across deserts, through Eurasia, into Australia, and much later into the Americas. Wherever they went, they adapted quickly, not by waiting for biology to catch up, but by changing behavior, tools, clothing, shelters, food strategies, and belief systems. This is one of the defining traits of our species. We are not especially specialized in body, but profoundly specialized in adaptation through culture. A human being can live near the Arctic, in rainforest, on a mountain plateau, or beside a dry desert coast, provided knowledge exists to make such life possible. That knowledge becomes inheritance just as meaningful as genes. But this triumph came at a cost. As modern humans spread, many large animals disappeared, often shortly after our arrival. Ecosystems changed under the pressure of a predator, unlike any that had existed before. One that planned, coordinated, remembered, and taught. And as our species expanded, other human species gradually vanished too. Some may have been driven out by competition. Some may have been weakened by climate instability or disease, and some were absorbed through interbreeding. Their genes still live in many of us. That may be one of the saddest and most beautiful parts of the story. The others are gone, and yet not entirely gone. We carry pieces of them. The human story that reaches you is not pure and singular. It is braided. It is a mingling of lineages, of ancient separations and later reunions. Much later still came agriculture, cities, states, writing, organized religion, philosophy, science, and the modern world. But from the perspective of deep time, all of that is astonishingly recent. Civilization is the thinnest surface layer over a much older inheritance. Beneath every skyscraper and every computer and every language spoken in modern streets, there still lives the legacy of tree-dwelling primates, upright walkers in African woodland, tool makers on ancient plains, fire tenders in the night, Ice Age hunters, bottleneck survivors, migrants crossing unfamiliar coasts, and storytellers passing memory from one generation to the next. You are not separate from that story. You are one brief continuation of it. And perhaps that is the most calming thought of all tonight. Human evolution was never a straight path toward perfection. It was uncertainty, improvisation, luck, loss, resilience, and repeated reinvention. Our ancestors were never guaranteed success. They survived storms they could not predict, climates they could not control, predators stronger than themselves, and landscapes that kept changing beneath their feet. They survived by staying connected, by learning, by remembering, by adapting, by carrying one another through difficulty. And now, after millions of years of that long and improbable journey, you are here, alive in the quiet present, able to look backward and understand that your existence rests on an endless procession of fragile victories. That is what you inherit. Not certainty, but endurance. Not a straight line, but a patient unfolding. Not perfection, but persistence. So as you begin to drift, let the immense scale of that story becomes soft around the edges. Let the forests blur into grassland, the grassland into firelight, the firelight into stars above migrating families, and the stars into the glow of the modern world. Let the millions of years stretch out behind you like a long road, disappearing into darkness, peaceful and steady and immeasurably deep. You do not need to hold all of it at once. You only need to rest inside it, knowing that you came from survivors, from learners, from wanderers, from beings who kept going through change after change until eventually the story reached you. And tonight, for a little while, you can simply be still at the far end of that ancient journey, breathing quietly, while all of history settles gently into sleep. And as you rest a little deeper now, allowing the rhythm of the story to settle into something slow and steady, we can continue gently forward along that long path that brought us here. Because even after our species, Homo sapiens, began to spread across the earth, the story did not suddenly become simple or easy. In many ways, it became more delicate, more dependent on learning, memory, and connection. These early humans did not carry cities with them, or written knowledge, or permanent homes. What they carried instead was something far more subtle: shared understanding. They carried ways of finding water in unfamiliar places, ways of reading the land, ways of recognizing safe foods and dangerous ones, ways of shaping tools, and ways of communicating all of this to one another. Knowledge became a kind of invisible shelter, something that could travel with them across mountains, along coastlines, through forests, and into lands no human had ever seen before. As these groups moved slowly, generation by generation, they began to form traditions. Not traditions written in books, but traditions held in memory, passed through stories, gestures, and repeated actions. A child would watch an elder shape a tool, or prepare food, or follow animal tracks across soft ground. They would imitate, slowly at first, then more confidently. Over time, these repeated patterns formed cultures, distinct ways of living adapted to particular environments. Along a coastline, people might become experts in tides, fish, and shellfish. In colder regions, others might learn the rhythms of migrating animals and the subtle signs of changing seasons. In forests, knowledge of plants, sounds, and hidden pathways would become essential. Each environment shaped the people within it, not just physically, but in the way they thought, observed, and remembered. And within all of this, something else was quietly growing: imagination. Humans were no longer simply reacting to the world around them. They were beginning to interpret it, to give it meaning beyond immediate survival. The earliest hints of symbolic thinking appear in small, almost fragile ways: patterns scratched into surfaces, pigments used to color objects or bodies, simple decorations that serve no direct survival purpose. These may seem like minor details, but they reveal something profound. They suggest that humans were beginning to think in abstractions, to see beyond what was immediately present, to express ideas, identities, or beliefs. It is as if the inner world of the human mind was slowly expanding, creating space for stories, for memory that goes beyond direct experience, and for connections between people that are not just physical, but emotional and symbolic. Eventually, this growing inner world found expression in something remarkable. Art. Deep within caves, far from sunlight, early humans painted animals, shapes, and scenes that still survive today. The flickering light of a fire would have made these images appear to move, to breathe, to shift across the uneven surfaces of stone walls. It is a quiet and almost dreamlike image. People gathered in the darkness, creating something not for immediate use, but for meaning, for expression, perhaps for ritual. These paintings are not just decorations. They are evidence of minds capable of imagination, memory, and shared understanding. They show us that even tens of thousands of years ago, humans were already thinking in ways that feel deeply familiar to us. As time continued its slow and steady movement, human groups became more connected, not just within themselves, but sometimes with one another. Paths were formed, routes repeated, knowledge exchanged. This was not a global network as we know today, but small, shifting webs of interaction. Ideas could travel from one group to another, changing slightly as they moved, adapting to new environments and needs. Over many generations, this created a kind of cultural evolution, layered on top of biological evolution. Tools became more refined, more specialized. Hunting strategies improved. Social structures became more complex. Cooperation became even more important because survival was no longer just about individual strength, but about the ability to function as part of a group. And then, after an immense stretch of time filled with movement, adaptation, and quiet innovation, something began to change again. In certain regions of the world, humans started to shift from a purely mobile lifestyle to something more settled. This did not happen all at once, and it did not happen everywhere. But in places where conditions allowed, people began to stay in one area for longer periods. They learned to cultivate plants, to manage resources, to shape the land in small but meaningful ways. This was the beginning of what we now call agriculture, though at the time it would not have felt like a revolution. It would have felt like a gradual adjustment, a series of small choices repeated over many years. With this shift came new challenges and new possibilities. Settled life meant more predictable food sources, but also new forms of labor, new social dynamics, and new dependencies. Communities grew larger. Structures became more permanent. The rhythm of life began to change, tied more closely to cycles of planting and harvesting rather than constant movement. Knowledge expanded again, now including the care of crops, the storage of food, and the management of shared spaces. And as communities grew, so did the complexity of relationships within them. Over time, these small settlements developed into larger communities, and eventually into the earliest forms of towns and cities. This transformation was slow, unfolding over thousands of years, but its effects were profound. For the first time, large numbers of people lived together in close proximity, sharing not just resources, but ideas, beliefs, and innovations. Communication became even more important, leading eventually to the development of early writing systems, ways to record information, to preserve knowledge beyond memory alone. This was another quiet but powerful shift, allowing ideas to travel across time as well as space. And yet, even as these new layers of human life formed, agriculture, settlements, writing, and early civilizations, the deeper story remained the same. Humans were still shaped by the same fundamental needs: to find food, to stay safe, to connect with others, to make sense of the world around them. The tools became more advanced, the structures more complex, but the underlying patterns continued. The long journey from those early primates in ancient forests to the first cities was not a straight path, but a continuous unfolding shaped by countless small decisions, adaptations, and moments of resilience. If you pause for a moment now and let your mind drift gently over this vast expanse of time, you might begin to feel how connected it all is. The ability to sit, to listen, to imagine, these are not modern inventions. They are part of a long inheritance, built slowly over millions of years. Every quiet moment of awareness, every small act of curiosity, every shared story, all of it reaches back through that deep history. And in a way, as you rest now, you are participating in that same pattern. Pausing, reflecting, allowing the mind to wander gently across time. The world today may feel fast, complex, and overwhelming at times, filled with constant movement and endless information. But beneath all of that, the deeper rhythm remains unchanged. The same slow processes that shaped life in the beginning continue in different forms around us. Growth, adaptation, connection, these are still the foundations of everything. And just as our ancestors found ways to rest, to gather, to share quiet moments in the midst of uncertainty, so too can we find those moments now. So as this story continues to unfold, you don't need to hold on to every detail. You don't need to remember every step along the way. It is enough to simply drift with it, to let the sense of time and continuity carry you gently forward. The long journey of human evolution is not something separate from you. It is something you are part of, something that lives quietly within you, shaping the way you think, feel, and exist in the world. And as you settle even deeper into that understanding, the story can soften again, becoming less about events and more about feeling, the steady passage of time, the quiet persistence of life, and the calm realization that everything you are has been shaped by an unbroken chain of moments stretching back into a past so vast it almost feels like a dream. And as that feeling deepens, as your breathing slows, and your thoughts begin to soften around the edges, we can continue moving forward. Not quickly, but in that same unhurried way that has carried this story across millions of years. Because even after the first settlements formed, after fields were planted, and early communities began to take shape, the human journey did not suddenly become stable or predictable. It remained, as it always had been, a balance between control and uncertainty, between what could be planned and what could never be fully known. In these early settled communities, people began to notice patterns more carefully than ever before. The movement of the sun across the sky, the shifting length of shadows, the return of certain stars at specific times of the year. All of these became important markers. Time itself, which had once been experienced mainly through immediate cycles of day and night or hunger and rest, began to stretch into something larger, something that could be observed, tracked, and anticipated. Seasons became more than changes in weather. They became guides for survival. When to plant, when to harvest, when to store, when to prepare. Life became structured in a new way, not just by instinct, but by observation and memory, extended across generations. And with this growing awareness came a deeper sense of connection to the world beyond the visible. Early humans, like all those before them, lived within nature, but now they began to reflect on it in new ways. The sky, once simply a distant presence, became something to interpret. The stars were no longer just points of light. They became patterns, stories, guides. The changing seasons, the cycles of growth and decay, the unpredictability of storms or droughts. These were not just events, but experiences that shaped belief, imagination, and meaning. Slowly, quietly, the earliest forms of spiritual thinking began to emerge, not as fixed systems, but as ways of understanding a world that could be both generous and harsh, predictable and mysterious. Communities grew, and as they did, relationships became more layered. It was no longer just small groups moving together. Now there were roles, responsibilities, expectations. Some people focused on growing food, others on shaping tools, others on organizing, guiding, or protecting the group. These roles were not rigid at first, but over time they became more defined. With larger groups came the need for cooperation on a scale never seen before, and also the need for ways to resolve conflict, to maintain balance, to ensure that the group could continue functioning as a whole. These early social structures were fragile, constantly adjusting, shaped by environment, resources, and human behavior itself. And still, even in these growing communities, the connection to the past remained close. The memory of movement, of migration, of living lightly on the land, did not disappear overnight. For many groups, a balance remained between settled life and mobility. Some would move seasonally, following resources while maintaining a sense of place. Others would remain more fixed, gradually building structures that would last longer, shaping the land more permanently. There was no single path, no universal pattern, only many variations, each shaped by local conditions and choices made over time. As generations passed, knowledge continued to accumulate. What had once been learned through direct experience could now be taught more deliberately. Children did not have to rediscover everything from the beginning. They could inherit skills, techniques, and understanding from those who came before. This accumulation of knowledge became one of the most powerful forces in human history. It allowed each generation to build upon the last, not just biologically, but culturally. And with this, the pace of change, while still slow compared to modern times, began to feel different, more layered, more complex, more connected. Eventually, in some regions, this accumulation reached a point where entirely new forms of life began to emerge. Villages became towns, and towns grew into early cities. Structures of stone and clay rose from the ground, replacing temporary shelter with something more enduring. Pathways became roads, connecting places that had once been distant. Trade began to develop, not just as occasional exchange, but as a regular part of life. Goods, ideas, and stories began to move between communities, linking them in ways that extended beyond immediate surroundings. With this increased connection came both opportunity and challenge. Interaction between groups could bring new knowledge, new resources, new ways of thinking, but it could also bring competition, misunderstanding, and conflict. The human story, even in these early stages, was never entirely peaceful or entirely chaotic. It was always a mixture, shaped by the same complex nature that defines us even now. Cooperation and conflict existed side by side, each influencing the other, each shaping the path forward in ways that were rarely simple or predictable. And through all of this, the human mind continued to expand its reach. Language became more refined, capable of expressing not just immediate needs, but abstract ideas, emotions, and shared narratives. Stories could now carry meaning across time, connecting people not just through direct experience, but through imagination. A story told around a fire could be remembered, repeated, adapted, and passed on, becoming part of a shared identity. This ability to create and share narratives is one of the quiet threads that runs through all of human history, linking the earliest storytellers to the present moment. If you let your mind drift gently here, you might begin to sense how all of these layers, movement, adaptation, memory, imagination, cooperation, are still present within us. They have not disappeared. They have simply taken new forms. The same mind that once watched the stars to track seasons now builds instruments to explore distant galaxies. The same hands that shaped simple stone tools now create objects of incredible precision and complexity. The same need for connection that once held small groups together around a fire now extends across continents through invisible networks. And yet beneath all of this, the deeper rhythm remains unchanged. The need to rest, to pause, to step away from constant activity and simply exist for a moment. That has always been part of the human experience. Our ancestors, after long days of movement or work, would have found moments of stillness, moments where the body could recover and the mind could settle. Those moments were not separate from survival. They were essential to it. Rest allowed energy to return, thoughts to organize, and the next day to begin again. So as this story continues, you can allow yourself to return to that same quiet place. There is no need to follow every detail, no need to hold on to every image. The story is vast, stretching far beyond what any one mind can fully contain. It is enough to simply feel it, to sense the continuity, the gentle unfolding of time, the steady presence of life moving forward through change after change. And somewhere within that vastness, there is a kind of calm, a recognition that everything, no matter how complex or uncertain, is part of a larger flow that has been continuing for billions of years. You are not separate from that flow. You are part of it, just as every human before you has been. And as you begin to drift further into rest, that connection can become something soft and reassuring, like a quiet current carrying you gently onward. The story does not rush, and neither do you. There is no urgency here, no need to reach an ending. Time itself stretches out, calm and patient, allowing everything to unfold at its own pace. And as you settle deeper into that rhythm, the details begin to fade slightly, not disappearing, but blending into a gentle background, like distant memories or soft echoes of something long ago. You can simply rest now within this long and continuous story, letting it carry you further and further into a place of quiet, where the past and present feel connected, and where everything slows just enough for sleep to arrive naturally, without effort, without resistance, like the closing of a long day that has finally come to an end.